Welcome back. If you've been following along, I've been rereading the Tom Clancy books, looking for little hints, suggestions, thoughts that he might have been a government asset of some kind. I think we've pretty much answered that question that the dude was getting help from somewhere. Now, some of all fears. I just finished this one. It is this 800-page monster that actually dropped on my foot while I was reading it. The foot's okay, barely. But the book itself takes place in 1990. Remember, at this time, Gulf War One was just kind of kicking off, was just kind of taking place. There was all this unrest in the Middle East. The first time we went into deal with Iraq under the first George Bush. The book came out in 1991, so the story kind of takes place in 1990-91 throughout that sort of Christmas into New Year's time period. Just shortly after the events from Clear and Present Danger, 2 years after the events from Clear and Present Danger. So Jack's a little bit further along in his career, but this one kind of deals with a slightly different topic area. This time, we're dealing with a broken arrow, which is a lost nuclear weapon. Now, oddly enough, this actually occurs with enough frequency that it has a term. And there are some lost and never been found nuclear weapons in the world. So it's not that big a stretch to think that this could actually take place. And we are still in a world that we've been told for years, and when the story was set, we're still in a world where we've been told for years that nuclear war could kind of happen at any second. You never know. And the Cold War was, it really ended, but we were still kind of coming out of that Cold War mentality, and Russia was still kind of figuring its way off in the world. It was no longer the USSR. It was sort of what it is now with less run room. But the world was much different. So of course Jack Ryan starts again, and this time things are potentially worse than he's ever seen in his career, in that the events could lead to World War III, and basically the entire story is showing how some out of the our militaries and our intelligence organizations tend to think inside certain boxes, and it does really show how some third party could exploit those boxes and kind of kick off World War III, where we end up fighting someone that's not them because we kind of mistake what's going on. And it is kind of a legitimate threat, if at least the way it's played out in the book. You can kind of see it happen. And in the book, a group of terrorists actually obtain a nuclear weapon, and they want to use it. They intend to detonate it someplace here in the United States, that would plunge the world into chaos. So they attack the Super Bowl. It takes place in sort of January-ish, and it. If you think about that for a minute, taking out the Super Bowl, you're going to take out industry leaders from all over the place. You could potentially take out some high-end political leaders. In this case, they took out a couple from high up in the government and the cabinet level that were supposed to be at the game, or were at the game. And really, I think the thing about the book is that Clancy was really warning us about the overall amount of power a small group of people using terror tactics could have on the world balance of power, and sort of the world being plunged into chaos. Um, so is he right? Is he wrong? Was he getting that hint from somebody? And if you think about what was going on at that point in time, with the Gulf War, and now we're starting to hear about these groups from the Middle East that eventually did cause us all kinds of problems. A small terror group causing the world to fly off into war, not that big a stretch. It has happened, right? Um, you look at what happened on 9/11, and sure enough, a terror group plunged us into war. And we had to go fit all kinds of crazy stuff. I don't need to review the history, but Tom Clancy did kind of point out that those groups do have that power. So was he getting sort of whispers from an intel agency about that? It very well could be, because if you think about it, in the time this was written, how widely thought about was that? I mean, we think about it now, but this was 35 years ago that he came up with this. So it kind of makes more sense looking at it backwards, saying, "Wow, he really did kind of have some help putting this stuff together." And he really does kind of point out in the book that if you think about the two things that have gotten us into more wars than anything else, is sort of religion and economics, right? If you want to go really kind of get people to go off and start fighting each other, use either religion or econ to do it, because people who are starving will do anything you want. People who believe in a particular religion will fight for that religion. That's just sort of the way things work. But the book itself is huge. It's an 800-page monster. There is a movie with Ben Affleck playing Jack Ryan, um, that it sort of is by the same name and has some of the same tone beats to it. But it's a 2-hour movie with an 800-page book. There was no way to really convert this. So the book itself um, is a very complex storyline, a very complex series of storylines. There's kind of an A story, a B story, and a C story going on. There's like 3 or 4 different books in one book here. And it really does kind of suffer from having one too many, or maybe even two too many storylines. But it gets into kind of how it even has a weird little storyline about how American Indians were treated over the years, and that still wasn't quite fixed, and sort of a sales pitch to fix that in the book. And he's right, but it didn't quite fit with the rest of the overtone of the book. He gets into a whole lot of details, and essentially is trying to gain popular support into various means to dealing with terrorist groups by using the intel agencies more freely. Um, and he even goes into uh, how to lesson about sort of geopolitics and using that sort of cult of personality that gets around certain things. And he even had a lot of details about Israel and basically how all things in that particular region kind of got to the state that they're in. Because that region of the world is still a mess to this day. It's been a mess forever, at least as long as I can remember. He does show how that conflict in the Middle East can impact the rest of the globe, as it is kind of always a powder keg. So, if you think about treaties and various agreements between nations, we're kind of bound by certain things. Say, hey, if you're in trouble, we're going to come help, and sometimes we usually go help. Well, notwithstanding some current geopolitics going on. But he does make a point that Israel's power in the Middle East really comes from the fact that they've always dealt with things with some sort of moral methodology, or at least that's been the public perception. And if they lose that moral high ground, they actually will lose their power, or they could lose their power, which is an interesting way to kind of think about things. So, and are they losing it today? Have they lost it? Think about that for a moment and decide for yourself. But it is an interesting way to put it, that they only have that power as long as they hold the moral high ground. Let that go, and you've kind of lost your footing. He does go into all kinds of details with the Middle East. He also goes into how in religion, with the when it comes to that and people going to war, even slight differences in religion will cause people to start blowing stuff up. Think about the Catholics and the Protestants in Ireland. It's almost like, hey, we both kind of agree on 98% of stuff, but it's not close enough, man. We're going to go blow you up because you that last bit we disagree on. I know there was a lot more to the Ireland thing than that. Okay. But that's, he is right in that very small differences in religion can cause very large conflicts between people. And if you think about our modern political system, he's kind of right about that too, in that people are like, well, if you're not with us, you're against us, and if you agree only with this part of our position, that's too bad. You got to agree with all this or get out. It's He's really right in that we do have these kind of group think mentalities that get us in a lot of trouble, where if you don't agree with me 100%, you're with that other group, and that group needs to be destroyed, therefore that's a problem. So he is kind of warning us about that stuff in this book. um he does also sort of bring us to about 100-page arc where he's trying to convince us that Eastern Bloc and Western nations should really work together, because it's really a fragile world, and if we kind of the Eastern Bloc and the Western nations are constantly sniping at each other, it's a bad thing. So I won't say he was trying to say, hey, look, there should be one world power, but he was saying, the US and other countries should really learn how to get along better, because that's really what's best for everybody. When everybody works together, life goes along swimmingly, at least more so than when we're at each other's throats. Um, and I think throughout the book, he goes to great lengths to try to convince us that intel agencies are there to keep the peace if they'll just be allowed to do their job. And I don't know that that's always true, but it is kind of an interesting series of thoughts that he comes across, that he's basically just saying, hey, intel agencies can do no wrong, but he's Tom Clancy, and he was always into that kind of stuff. So he does go on for several chapters about how to fabricate nuclear bombs. And let me put my I am actually a physicist hat on. The physics in it is right. It's also publicly available. There's nothing in there that's surprising. Nothing in there you can't find in a textbook. And he brings up the point over and over and over and over again that you can't classify science once it's known. You can classify the engineering side of a nuclear weapon, but once the science is known, really not that difficult to go figure out. The hard part is the first one, and that was figured out in the 1940s. So now nuclear physics is known well enough that if you have the material building a crude device, not as efficient as like what the U.S. has in our arsenal, Russia has in theirs, and other countries have in theirs. But if you wanted to build a crude device, not that difficult to do if you have the right scientists on your team. It's really not. And he goes into a lot of detail about how that's true. And he shows how a small group of people with not a huge budget, if they had the material, could go off and do it. And he's right. He's absolutely right. That could occur. And could that nuclear weapon be used to start an international conflict? And he's right that it really could. Um, so the book itself almost has too many subplots. It does suffer from this sort of Tom Clancy wants to prove to the world he's smarter than everybody else moment in a couple of ways. But I also think it has an interesting message in that a small group of people using the right tactics can cause mass chaos on planet Earth. And we've seen that occur since this book was published. So was that a warning that he got from somebody that said, "Hey, we should really figure out how to keep track of these things and not make that occur," or was it just he got lucky? I think he had somebody whispering to him personally, at least on this storyline, because this was way in advance of some of the stuff that's going on today, and there's no way he could have put this together, knowing what he put. Now maybe he did, but he got 800 pages of gobbledygook out of it. So um, the book is very deep. It's very complex. I don't know how you would turn this one into a movie any better than they did. The movie itself, I think, was a reasonable action film, but I didn't feel like a Jack Ryan film. To me, John Krasinski does a great job of making me feel like I'm watching Jack Ryan on the streaming series. Harrison Ford, that is Jack Ryan to me. Alec Baldwin and Hunt for Red October, it felt like Jack Ryan, right? But Affleck's a great actor, but the film trying to take 800 pages and cram it into the time they had, it just didn't work. But it does kind of bring the point up, don't let chaos win. The only way to keep chaos in check is to ensure that honorable people are in charge who truly care about peace and they're not constantly out there looking for a fight. I think that's the point of the book. And I think back in 1990, that was kind of world leaders. That's kind of what we were trying to get to. And I think he had people whispering to him to put something out like that. And it is a great book once you get past the sort of subplots that almost take up too much time because they really don't move the story forward. They're just sort of building up Jack as a character or building up other people's characters. And that's great. But I think it really could have used about 200 pages of editing down. But if you're a Clancy fan and you're this sort of thing, it is worth taking the time. There's a good audiobook version of it, so check that out. But I think this is another one we could put in the column of, yeah, he was getting stuff whispered to him from someplace because there's a whole lot of stuff in here that it would be tough to kind of piece together unless you had insight into what the intel agencies were looking at. And I'm not saying he had classified information, but I think, if somebody whispered idea nuggets, he could have run with them. So, it's a great book. I'm kind of enjoying going through things in the timeline order. This was Sum of All Fears. Next up is Debt of Honor. And watching Jack Ryan develop as a character is kind of interesting up until this point because he's deputy, sort of second in charge at CIA, and he's going to get this big career going, and he's so good at his job, and he cares about his job, and he's coming apart as a husband and a father, but he cares about his job, right? So you can kind of identify with Jack because who hasn't been there when you have to work too much and it kind of messes with your personal life. So you really can identify with Jack Ryan, the character. And I think Tom Clancy was putting himself into that character a lot. He was very open about it. And if you look at what was going on in his life at this point, I think he was kind of coming apart in the personal life because he was so focused on the professional. And I think that came through in the book. So I enjoyed it. It is a fantastic storyline. It does suffer from a little bit of skim certain sections just because it doesn't really move the story forward and focus on those parts that matter. But I enjoyed it. So I hope you do too. And I think this is another one that puts in the column of, yeah, he was getting whispered to from somebody. Everybody have a great day. And I'll see you on the next one, which is Dead of Honor, which is set in 95 and 1995 to 1996, which is another really good one. Actually, I remember that one from years ago. It's an excellent book. So we'll see everybody on the next one.